The Ukrainian tanker war goes on, and for the first time, a Ukrainian drone has attacked a Russian tanker outside the Black Sea. This now greatly increases the danger for the Russians. This is happening as victory reports come from Kupiansk, but the situation is so different that major Russian mill bloggers are mocking their own army's reports. And we have more images from Novorossiysk that give us an impression of how extensive the damage is to the Russian submarine that was recently hit by a Ukrainian drone. That's it. We also have more on international aid, but let's start with the situation report. Heiliger Stroh says, "Save the most at Holy now with my code." General Syrsky, Ukraine's commander-in-chief, says Ukrainians have regained 90% control of Kupiansk. That is probably close to reality. We see that the Ukrainian side itself admits that certain areas within Kupiansk are still under Russian control. However, they are cut off. Meanwhile, there are the first recordings from journalists who are moving around in Kupiansk with Ukrainian military escorts. However, it shows that the sounds of battle can still be heard there and that drones still appear from time to time. This means the city is still insecure. The Ukrainians are advancing, putting massive pressure on the Russians there. However, that doesn't stop Russian mill bloggers from claiming that Russian soldiers are operating comfortably within Kupiansk. Even without the enemy having any say in the matter, a geolocated video is published there in Kupiansk. We also have Valery Gerasimov, the Russian chief of the General Staff, who announces through the Russian Ministry of Defense that 19 Ukrainian battalions have been cut off in Kupiansk. So winning on all fronts? These reports are so absurd that major Russian military bloggers from Riga are mocking them for being completely false. Because in fact, for example, this video here was geolocated in the village of Tavlishanka, and that's northeast of Kupiansk. And it's actually quite a good distance if we take a look at it. Here is Kupiansk, and up there is where it was geolocated east of Novorossiysk. That means we have it here in this region is where this footage was taken. If it's here in Tavlishanka, of course, if it's 20 kilometers from the front line, then it's no surprise that the Ukrainians aren't intervening to prevent such footage. We've reached a point where the Russian General Staff reports clear falsehoods, claiming victory while actually facing defeat. And Russian military bloggers are filming footage far behind the front lines to claim that it's a captured frontline position. Then we have information from Crimea. There, the Security Service of Ukraine announced destroying more high-value targets. Here, a thermal imaging device captures a tank system moments before impact. Radar systems, various radar systems, and a MiG-31. The MiG-31 in particular should be especially interesting because it is no longer in production by the Russians and at the same time is probably their most capable interceptor, which in addition is also able to perform due to its powerful engines, to launch the air-launched ballistic systems of the Kinzhal missiles into the air and give them the necessary kinetic energy so that they can actually have their intended effect. That means one of them was probably hit, and probably at this point, because in fact only pictures were released. In the past, we were spoiled by always seeing videos that more or less showed us the impacts. In this case, we only have the footage, which would theoretically allow for a forgery. It's pretty unlikely, but at least at this point, we only have images that don't necessarily show the destruction of these targets in the full context. Then we have information from Novorossiysk. This image was circulating yesterday, according to which the Russians had sunk several barges at the entrance to the port of Novorossiysk. That would effectively lock their entire war fleet in Novorossiysk. However, I'm not sure here whether they were actually sunk. When we look at it, it seems to me as if they're still above water. And of course, you shouldn't forget that a vessel like this has a certain draft and a certain freeboard. But in order to look out from above, the distance between the freeboard and the bottom of the boat would have to be large enough to cover the entire water depth, and beyond that to reach the surface, and that's simply unlikely because the harbor has the necessary depth to allow warships to enter. In my opinion, they simply serve as a physical blockade. There is probably still a torpedo net in front of that. That allows the Russians to prevent the Ukrainians from simply blasting their way through with several explosive boats in succession, because the barge is in the way as a large physical barrier. There are also rumors that the Ukrainians might use jumping drones. It's unclear how true that is, but the theory itself is simple. Take a drone. Accordingly, you accelerate an underwater drone and then let it break out of the water at an angle. Then, of course, it could jump over a torpedo net and then look for its next target in the harbor basin itself. If, of course, I have mounted such boats behind the torpedo net, which are certainly 15 to 20 meters wide, then such a jump should have been made impossible. That means those boats should help with that too. Meanwhile, I noticed more recordings. Here we have an analyst who says it existed. These boats have blocked the harbor entrance before, so they were likely not sunk. It just shows us that the Russians are taking the blockade of the harbor entrance seriously. Then we published images here from the Ukrainian journalist Sternenko, which show us the damage to the harbor itself. If we look at the damage here, we can see that there is massive damage to the pier itself. And we can compare the ship and its sister ship, and we see it almost looks like there's no difference. But when we look, it seems as if the ship here is just a little bit longer behind this visible part of the ship than this one here, which would suggest that this submarine is sitting a bit lower in the water, which of course would be an indication that it had taken on water. At the same time, as I said, here is the hit, which would be at the stern. This here was sometimes understood as a leak. However, that is likely the exhaust of the diesel engine because it is located at the conning tower. That means when the diesel engine is running on board, it would produce these clouds of smoke accordingly. It's unclear why the diesel engine is running in this footage, though some speculate it's due to the bilge pump operating at full power. That's one explanation, but not the only one. But as I said, the ship is probably sitting a little bit lower in the harbor, but likely not dramatically lower. There are explanations that 2 watertight compartments were flooded, and this would have caused damage accordingly. But it must be clear, if the explosion was at the stern, then the propeller and the rudder must have been clearly damaged. That could also have led to internal damage. Along the drive shaft, which is physically connected to the propeller and extends deep into the submarine, depending on the direction from which the pressure of the explosion comes, this can endanger the drive shaft. And otherwise, of course, we also have to say that if the ship is sitting lower and has taken on water, at least in parts, then that also causes severe damage inside. In addition, there is a claim that the stern of the submarine is missing. To be honest, you can pause the video and check for yourself. I can't say for sure if the stern is missing, especially if we assume that the submarine might be lying a bit deeper. This is actually supposed to indicate a leak. I'm not 100% sure about that either, but at least it points in that direction. But we also need to understand what this means. During World War II, depth charges were deadly if they exploded within 8,000 of a submarine. These contained around 100 kilograms of explosives, sometimes slightly more or less. And the estimated detonation effect of this underwater drone is between 200 and 400 kilos. At least that's what I've read. I can't judge that personally. If we're talking about 200 to 400 kilograms, the distance over which serious damage occurs would be much greater. Of course, a kilo-class submarine is more robust than a Type 7 submarine from World War II, but we can roughly apply that here as well. During World War II, an 8-meter distance was considered fatal, while at 20 meters the submarine could still sustain serious damage. Then, of course, even with a more modern, more robustly built submarine, you can expect noticeable damage at just a few meters distance. However, it should also be clear that the submarine will not be operational again anytime soon, not only because the propeller and the rudder are most likely damaged, because the drive shaft may be damaged, and because it may have at least partially taken on water. Shipyard capacity is also a problem for the Russians, and the largest shipyard capacities are in Sevastopol. To do that, however, they would have to transport a damaged submarine across the Black Sea, which would of course be a perfect target for the Ukrainians. That means we can probably assume that this submarine will stay in the harbor until the end of the war and won't leave the harbor during that time. Those were the reports we have from Novorossiysk, but more and more is happening. In fact, we have this new footage from the Ukrainians. This is a Russian tanker that was attacked in the Mediterranean, and we can see impacts here. What's interesting is we also have aerial footage, and you can see from here, in my opinion, that's a bomb drone that's just dropping the explosives. What we see up here, let me show you. Can you see it hovering here? At this spot, in my opinion, that's clear a bomb drone. You could see it just above again there, so this time no sea drones that rammed into the ship. I can't say anything about the damage or the extent of the damage at the moment. The tanker was probably empty. At least that's the information I have. Of course, also with the intention of preventing any oil spills from occurring, or at least preventing any unnecessarily large oil spills. But here, another attack has taken place. What's important here is that such an attack, like the one here in the Mediterranean, either came from Libya, from Greece, or from a ship. And that's a completely new escalation because it means that attacks on Russian tankers are no longer geographically limited, but are now conceivable worldwide. And here we have a Russian blogger, military informant, who says it's absolutely possible that the Baltic fleet could be next with these attacks. So here too we see that on the Russian side, they are taking this very seriously. The Ukrainians can now obviously attack Russian ships far beyond the Black Sea. That means not just tankers, but, as he fears, even attacks on the Baltic fleet are possible. And information about this can be found here, for example, with today's sponsor. Today's video is brought to you by Ground News. This is a website and an app that helps you read the news by collecting information in a simpler and more data-driven way. Ground News collects and organizes thousands of news articles by topic daily from around the world. Each article receives analyses regarding ideological alignment, reliability, and authorship, and all of this is to help you understand the background of the information being presented. As you can see, I use Ukrainian sources like Sternenko or Russian sources like Ryba or Military Informant because I want to be fully informed. And because you can only get to the bottom of the facts if you look at all sides, that's where Ground News helps too. And so, for example, with this article about this very attack, we can see that 49 recorded media outlets reported on it, 11 of them are on the political left, and 10 of them are on the political right. We can see how factually accurate they are. For one thing, we see that 81% of the media reporting on this are highly factually accurate. This gives us strong evidence the story is true. In this case, of course, we know it, but with less well-known media or less well-known events, this helps us enormously. And here, for each of the reporting media, we can also see how high their factual accuracy has been in the past, as well as their political orientation. But we can also see who owns them. Here, for example, we can see the different owners, and we can also see that here. That's relevant when 13% are government sources. If a media outlet reports on something and it's owned by a government, we can of course assume that the orientation of the report aligns with the intentions and political goals of that government. All of this helps us, but we can also compare left and right headlines. Here, it's less dramatic. There are cases where the left and right frame events very differently, with one calling something a crime and the other seeing it as legitimate. Reading only within our political bubble makes us miss this comparison. The blind spot helps with that too. For example, we have that up here. There we can see which media we would have missed if we were following a particular political direction. We have many examples. For example, the left rarely reports on these topics. Coverage mostly comes from the right. And of course, the same applies to the right-wing political spectrum. There we have reports where the right-wing media practically ignore it completely. All of this helps with all these things. Ground News is essential for my daily research. I never make videos now without first checking or using Ground News. If you want to use it too, if you want to prevent yourself from being pushed into a political bubble by biased media, then I can wholeheartedly recommend Ground News to you. You save 40% with the Vantage plan, which I also use myself if you use my link, which you can access either through the QR code or of course in the description. At this point, once again, thank you to Ground News for sponsoring the video, and now let's move on to international support. There we have the reports from the Czech Republic, from Czechia. That STV machinery has started producing BMP-1 vehicles. If I understand correctly, the STV group owns companies in both Slovakia and Czechia. So that's not a contradiction, and what's interesting is that BMP-1s are being restored there. That's the first real infantry fighting vehicle of the Soviet Union. It's at least 60 years old, likely from the late 60s or early 70s, and is being put back into service. What's interesting, of course, is that it's being modernized, modern manufacturing techniques are being used, and modern materials are being used to bring the vehicle up to a modern standard, so to speak. It's expected to have a capacity of 100 vehicles per year, and they're talking about a new customer abroad. Who this customer is, who is interested in buying BMP-1s, is at least pretty obvious, most likely in Ukraine. And we have to say the BMP-1 itself is completely outdated today, but not in every form. The Ukraine itself uses the BMP-1, which is a modernized version that we can see here. In this case, the basic hull has received a modernized turret, which, instead of the 73 mm low-pressure cannon, is equipped with a 30 mm autocannon. It has a grenade launcher and can fire Stugner ATGMs, that is, anti-tank guided missiles, carrying 4 of them on board. This gives the vehicle the firepower of a modern infantry fighting vehicle, sometimes even more than some modern infantry fighting vehicles. And if modern techniques and materials are used for the armor, for the hull, then the level of protection shouldn't be dramatically different from the original effect. This would bring real benefits to Ukraine, because this would of course mean that they could immediately deploy a system they are familiar with and for which they probably already have some spare parts. And the retraining of the crew from an old BMP-1 to a modern one, even if it has a new gun, even if it has new technology on board, it should of course be dramatically easier, just like for the mechanic, than if he has to learn something completely new. Here, Ukraine will probably soon receive 100 new old infantry fighting vehicles. Many indications suggest this is the case. And then we have the news from Australia that the last Abrams have now been delivered to Ukraine. This means that all 49 M1A1 Abrams that the Australians had have now been handed over to Ukraine, so now almost 50 more Abrams are in the hands of Ukraine to support them. And that's it for today's situation report. If you enjoyed it, I'd appreciate a thumbs up. Leave a comment if you have anything to add. And if you're new here, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and click the bell so you don't miss future videos. I'd like to thank Ground News again for sponsoring this video. As I mentioned, you can get 40% off the Vantage plan with the link I recommend. That's all from me for now. Thanks for your attention. See you soon. I want to sincerely thank the supporters, especially Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Kamp and Lieutenant Jans van Eck, über de Vren, nickname 2.bib Carsten Schulz. Gulasch Nasha 4000 Tequila 42 Badass Lawyer Vision Sound Lab PK If Wanwu Mahamori. Thanks to Robert Veal 1528 Bertenmont Janiscu, Anti-X, Sasha Müller, Cunningham and Eustress. Without them, it wouldn't be possible like this.